All right, so now we're into week 10, and this week segues nicely from last week. So last week we talked about the problem of evil argument, and then the segue comes from the response that we looked at to the problem of evil argument, which was specifically the free will defense. The free will defense, if you'll recall, said that, well, look, there is some evil in the world, at least in the form of evil acts which people, it's talking specifically when it's talking about evil acts, bad things, wrong actions that people take. Those things exist because free will exists. In order for us to have free will, there must be the possibility that we'll do some bad things, and of course, inevitably, some people will choose to do some bad things, but it will make the good things that they choose in some way better because they were freely chosen rather than, say, compelled or pre-programmed in, something to that effect. And so the evils that come along with the existence of free will are worth it and are necessary for the greatest good, the best possible world to exist. And therefore, God, even knowing about such evils attending free will allow them to occur because overall it leads to a better world. That's more or less what the free will defense says. Now, of course, this assumes, and also you read in Anselm's piece why that might not be, that is possibly not the correct way to think of free will, that it will inevitably, that the possession of free will inevitably lead to evil actions. But that's neither here nor there. One other possible problem with the free will defense is that it assumes that we do have free will. It says, look, people do some bad things, but that's just because we have free will, and that's the cost of doing business. The existence of free will is itself a long and highly debated topic in philosophy. So that's what we're going to look at today. We're segueing into that. We're seeing, well, is it a kind of uncontroversial assumption? Is it safe to try and, as it were, defend the existence of this particular conception of God by invoking the existence of free will? So, as I said, there's a great deal of literature about this. The discussion of free will, whether it exists or not, probably goes back just as far as the problem of evil, if not farther. So many hundreds of years at least. And we're not going to dip too far into that literature because it's tremendous and gets, like most tremendous philosophical literature, rather complicated. We actually won't even talk about all the possible positions that one might take up with respect to this. We're going to look at a very limited cross-section, but an informative cross-section nonetheless. So why is it such a popular topic of discussion? Well, because there seemed to be so much at stake in answering the question of whether or not we do, in fact, have free will. So as we will see, there is some moral issues, that is, the propriety of praising, blaming, rewarding, and punishing people on the strength of their actions is seen to be bound up with the existence of free will by many. Issues of human nature and uniqueness, that is, so if you recall a little bit from what Anselm said, human beings are supposed, at least in Anselm's worldview, to be unique amongst created creatures in that they have free will. And so, well, if we want to maintain this view that human beings are special somehow, if we want to distinguish them from other highly complex animals like primates, dolphins, certain sorts of birds, octopodes, all those different creatures which are rather intelligent and behave in complicated fashions, we need to sort of, as it were, add something else. And so human uniqueness is one of those conclusions or sort of presumptions that humans have about ourselves that you'll often see cropping up as reasons why particular theses are put forward. Now, it's not necessarily a good reason. I'm not saying that these are good reasons for free will being a popular topic. I'm just saying that they are the reasons. And then finally, of course, there are religious issues, which we talked about last week. So that's why it's been seen, it's seen so much ink over the years. So the first argument we're going to look at is incredibly short and incredibly simple, which I'm sure you'll find a welcome change from some of the other arguments we've looked at. So we have 3 lines here. Premise 1, if we are morally responsible, then we have free will. We are morally responsible, so conclusion, we do have free will. Okay, another simple modus ponens here. And this particular argument we're going to be looking at, we're going to be talking about in one way or another throughout the entire first part. So despite it being very short, there's a lot of issues that go into figuring out and interpreting it. So it looks pretty simple. Not much to say about it. So basically, the reason why these two things are bound up, the reason why this is seen to be a legitimate statement, a little bit conditional statement, if we are morally responsible, then it must be the case that we have free will. The idea here is that it being reasonable, appropriate, for it to make sense that we say to somebody, oh, good job, so-and-so, or, oh, that was terrible, you should feel bad, or here's $5 million for, saving this city, whatever, that kind of reward, praise, blame stuff. We want the actions of people who are rewarded, praised, blamed, so on, to be up to them in some way, that they have some sort of control over it. So we can see as the example here, would you find it appropriate to blame me, to punish me for stealing your sandwich if I were mind controlled to do so by a vampire, right? We have this idea that people who are compelled or sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? The legal term, coerced into doing things, at least have some kind of diminished responsibility for it. So we don't only think of this in the sort of abstract metaphysical sense. This is enshrined in our daily practices of praise and blame and in our legal practices as well, right? So someone can be, it can be the case that someone is physically responsible for having done something, right? So let's say that I push you down the stairs. However, if it is determinable that I pushed you down the stairs, but I was sort of sleepwalking while I did so, or something kind of bizarre like that, we wouldn't charge me with murder if you died. It might be something like involuntary manslaughter. There are different legal charges which are based on the same set of, as it were, physical behavioral facts. And then the difference between the various charges depends on these facts about intention and control over actions, right? So we, again, might cut someone some slack if they, stole your wallet because someone else had a gun to their head and told them that they had to steal your wallet, or they shoot you, right? Things like that. Now, it's going to be very important that ultimately we distinguish between this kind of legal idea of being free and this more metaphysical idea of being free. We need to distinguish them, not necessarily because they really are distinct, but because we need to be able to consider whether or not they are distinct. We can't sort of have them all mashed up together at the beginning and assume that they're the same. We have to be able to separate them and then sort of think later whether or not they really are separate. And hopefully that will make sense probably in the second part. In any case, so that's the first premise. The second premise is simply stating a fact. It's almost encoding an observation about our practices. We do, in fact, praise and blame people. We do, in fact, think that it is appropriate to do so. That, some people, when they do something bad, it was up to them. They could have done something else, but they did the bad thing anyway, and so therefore they deserve to be punished. They deserve to be blamed. It is appropriate to do so, right? So whereas you wouldn't blame me if I stole your sandwich while being mind-controlled by a vampire. You would blame me if I stole your sandwich without being controlled by an evil vampire or anything else. If I just did it because I was hungry and your sandwich is right there and I'm like, who cares, right? Then you would blame me for that. So we do blame people for things. Therefore, we are at least sometimes morally responsible. Therefore, we have free will, right? Now, as I've said before, modus ponens is sort of the flip side of modus tollens. And the problem between a kind of modus ponens version of an argument and modus tollens is that, well, there's not often a principled way to distinguish between which one is sound, right? They're both going to be valid versions of the idea, but we can't tell which one is sound. So, whereas the first version of the argument, we have modus ponens. If we are responsible, then we have free will. So if P, then Q. Well, here's P. We are morally responsible, therefore Q. That's the modus ponens. Now, we could go the other way and say, well, look, the first statement is the same. If we are morally responsible, then we have free will. If P, then Q. But then we say, actually, not Q. We don't have free will. In which case, we can conclude that we aren't morally responsible. So, why it's tricky to tell the difference between those two is because this premise here, we are morally responsible, is, as I said, an encoding of our observations about the fact that we do praise and blame people. We're kind of, as it were, assuming that our praise and blame is appropriate. Now, if we don't have free will, the situation could look exactly the same. We would still go around praising and blaming people, but it would be inappropriate to do so, right? Inappropriate in some moral sense. Now, it might be, and it would be if we don't have free will, that we can't help but praise and blame people, right? We're sort of programmed to do it. But nonetheless, it's sort of inappropriate. It's wrong. It's not fitting because these people, like us, couldn't have done otherwise. So it's very difficult to see how we could tell the difference between these two situations. And so as far as it goes at the moment, it's not clear which of the modus ponens version or the modus tollens version is the sound one. So we need to dig a little bit deeper. Now, so we're still essentially talking about the same argument. What we're going to look at now is a way to get a better definition of what moral responsibility is. And so this principle of alternative possibilities, I believe, comes from, it's either Leibniz or Kant. I can't remember off the top of my head. I believe that the article that you read, one of the articles that you read for the week, of which there are many this time around. I'll talk about that at the end of the second part. So this is from either Kant or Leibniz, so it's a way of considering or talking about moral responsibility that's been around for quite some time, a couple hundred years again. And the idea here is that moral responsibility consists in the following: the ability to have done otherwise, right? So I'm currently wearing a black hoodie. I have a red one. I have a gray and blue one. I could have put one of those other ones on instead. Assuming that it's true that I could have put one of those on instead, I exercised my free will in wearing the black one, right? Because I could have chosen a different hoodie, okay? So it's a very simple idea. So the principle of alternative possibility says a person is morally responsible for what they have done only if they could have done otherwise. So, for instance, if I was being compelled somehow to wear the black hoodie, right, then it's not true that I could have done otherwise, and so I'm not responsible for it. Again, this was reflected when I was talking about how we sort of attribute to people diminished responsibility and therefore diminished blame if, say, they were sleepwalking when they committed some crime. I mean, I don't know if that's ever actually been a defense, but except on like Law and Order or something like that, but you get the point. So if someone is in a situation in which they could not have done otherwise, then they're not morally responsible. That's the general criterion here being put forward for moral responsibility. Okay, so keep that in mind. We're going to switch gears for a second and talk about, give some definitions of different positions which are taken in the literature about free will. So largely, the literature on free will centers on this debate about whether free will is compatible with what's called determinism. Determinism is a thesis about essentially how the universe works. And so the question is, if the universe is deterministic, can we have free will? If we say yes, then we're the compatibilist. If we say no, then we're incompatibilist. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Determinism, the way to sort of, one of the ways to articulate it is as follows. The universe is deterministic if future events are necessitated, that is, made necessary by past events combined with the laws of nature, right? So we're to imagine that we have the laws of nature, which, so now we're not really talking about them necessarily in David Hume's sense. We're talking about them in the more abstract, fixed sense. The laws of nature are not encodings of our actual observations. They are the principles by which the universe actually works. The universe is programming, if you will. That's how we're talking about it here. So the idea is that programming of the universe makes it such that whenever you put in certain input, then there is a single unique outcome of that input. So think about it as a calculator. If you have a calculator and you put 2 plus 2 in the calculator, the programming of the calculator means that the only possible output when the input is 2 plus 2 is 4, right? Calculators in that way are deterministic, or at least, as far as our metaphor goes, they're deterministic. So no matter what, when you put 2 plus 2 in a calculator, unless it's malfunctioning, it's going to spit out 4, right? So the idea is that the universe is like that. The way it's programmed, for every particular input, there is a unique output. And so the inputs here are sort of like the full description of the events that are happening. So given the full description of events that are happening in the universe right now, and the laws of nature as they are, there is only one way the universe can be in the next second. And then on the basis of that, there's only one way the universe can be 2 seconds later. And then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So there's a sense in which every moment in time is fully determined immediately by the moment directly before it. And so on and so forth back to the beginning of time. That's determinism. Indeterminism is just the denial of that. It says future events are not necessitated by past events combined with the laws of nature. That is, given a full description of what's going on right now and the programming of the universe, there is not a fixed, unique output. Okay, so a kind of rough and ready way of describing indeterminism would be a calculator that when you put 2 plus 2 in, 4 might come out, but 6 might come out, but x plus 2 might come out, right? Whatever might come out. Now, that's actually not a very, that's a very basic and largely inaccurate way of talking about indeterminism. That makes indeterminism seem synonymous with randomness, which it could be, but it need not be. So in very complicated theoretical physics that I don't understand, you get this idea of the universe perhaps being indeterministic in that there are certain bounds of things that could happen, right? But not literally anything could happen. So, yeah, I'm not really equipped to explain it any better than that, but sort of the idea is that, for instance, it's true that sometime in the future, this molecule of a radioactive, this atom of a radioactive substance will decay, therefore emitting some particle. It's going to do it in the future. There's no question about that. It's just a matter of how likely it is at any given point in the future that's going to do it. So there is no fact determined by the past states of affairs and the nature of this radioactive element that it will definitely decay and release a particle in 5 minutes. It's that, well, it might do it in 5, it might do it in 10, it might do it in 20, but it's going to do it somewhere in there, right? So indeterminism can be a little bit more restricted, not totally random in that sense. But thankfully, we don't really need to deal with indeterminism in particular because we are skipping over the question of to what extent free will requires or is compatible with indeterminism, right? Compatibilism and incompatibilism are only addressing whether or not free will can go with determinism. So that brings us to the definitions of those. Compatibilism is just the idea that free will can exist in a world in which determinism is true. That is, the compatibilist says that it's possible to have free will in a world where every future moment is necessitated by the moment before it and a full description of the laws of nature, right? The incompatibilist says, on the other hand, free will cannot exist in a world in which determinism is true. So those are the two positions we're looking at. Okay, so we have now the principle of alternative possibilities, which, as you recall, was a way to more specifically define moral responsibility. So we can take the original argument from the second slide, and now wherever we see the word morally responsible, we can plug in the principle of alternative possibilities. So instead of this argument here, we get the one down here. If we could have done otherwise, then we have free will. We could have done otherwise, therefore we have free will, right? So that's the modus ponens version of the argument with the principle of alternative possibilities plugged into it. But there's also the modus tollens version, which we can also plug the principle of alternative possibilities into. So instead of the top argument, we now get this bottom one. If we could have done otherwise, then we have free will. Again, that's the same as it always was, it's the same between both the modus ponens and the modus tollens version. And now we plug in, we replace 2 from the original one up here, and we say, oh, actually, we could not have done otherwise. Therefore, we do not have free will. Now, that's a little bit less vague, and we're in more of a position to evaluate what's going on here. We can now sort of say to what extent free will is compatible with determinism, at least in so much as sort of moral responsibility leads us to know whether we have free will, and in as much as moral responsibility is correctly defined in terms of the principle of alternative possibilities. So, we get this. It seems like endorsing the principle of alternative possibilities makes free will incompatible with determinism, right? Why? Well, determinism says that at any moment, any action, any event is fully determined by the moment before it, combined with the laws of nature. That is, there is no other way things could have gone, right? So, given that description, going back to this example of my hoodie, I put on this black hoodie. I selected the black hoodie. I put it on, and given, the state of the universe and the laws of nature when I woke up right before I put it on, there's only one thing that could have happened. I only could have put on the black hoodie. The fact that I have other colored ones is sort of irrelevant, right? The programming of the universe and then the full description of the way the universe is combined together to make it so that the only thing that I could have done, is put on this black one. Now, of course, if that's true, then it wasn't up to me in some sense. I didn't freely choose it in some sense, and so it looks like I'm not responsible for having chosen it. And so fill in some example of an actual moral choice, and well, there you have it. So it looks like we have to endorse incompatibilism if we want to define moral responsibility in terms of the principle of alternative possibilities. However, Harry Frankfurt, who is an American philosopher who's actually still alive, pretty old though, is perhaps most famous for providing a possible way out of this problem, right? He gives an argument against the principle of alternative possibilities as a correct gloss for moral responsibility, saying that being morally responsible for an action is not the same thing as being able to have done otherwise. And then that gives us a little bit of wiggle room, perhaps, to say that we have moral responsibility and therefore perhaps free will, even when it's not possible that we could have done otherwise. How does that argument go? So there's a whole literature. So the literature on free will is huge. The literature on free will, particularly as a question of whether or not it is compatible with determinism and indeterminism, is a subset of that huge literature, but is huge in and of itself. A subset of the literature about whether or not determinism and free will are compatible is this Frankfurt-style literature, which is also huge, right? So it's like a series of nested infinities or something like that. Not quite that huge, but you get the point. So the Frankfurt-style cases, they are meant to show that you can be morally responsible while not having been able to do otherwise. So here's a concrete example, and these are sort of Halloween themed, as you can see. Suppose that Dracula wants me to steal your sandwich. He is content to let things unfold without intervening so long as your sandwich gets stolen by me. If I should decide not to steal your sandwich, Dracula will use his magical powers to compel me to steal your sandwich. As it turns out, I steal your sandwich of my own accord, right? I decide to do it all by myself, and Dracula doesn't have to, hypnotize me or anything. So Dracula's happy having gotten what he wants, namely me stealing your sandwich, without having to exert any extra effort. This is the style of a Frankfurt case. It is a case in which someone is poised to do something morally significant, usually bad, and if they don't do the bad thing, there is some external agent who is going, or if they attempt not to do the bad thing, there is some external agent who is going to force them to do it. I believe the original example has to do with a neuroscientist who's controlling you with like a brain implant chip, right? Is going to make you, if you don't rob the bank, the evil neuroscientist is going to make you do it through the control chip, right? So any type of situation which has that structure is a Frankfurt-style case. Now, this is supposed to demonstrate that moral responsibility and the ability to do otherwise come apart, that they're not the same thing. How? So, Frankfurt asks a couple of questions. He said, look, am I morally blameworthy for the heinous theft of your sandwich in the preceding case? Frankfurt says yes, even though, in a sense, I could not have done otherwise, right? So the idea is that, again, if I attempted to choose to not steal your sandwich, Dracula would hypnotize me and make me do it anyway. So the idea is, no matter what, I am going to take your sandwich, whether by my own free will, by my own option, or otherwise. There is no world in which I do not steal your sandwich. So there is no sense in which I could have done otherwise, Frankfurt says. So the idea here is that if I had decided not to steal your sandwich, I would have compelled to do it anyway. Sure, but who cares? I did decide, and it was that decision that caused the stealing of your sandwich. And so because it was my own decision, my own, as we might say, endogenously created desire, that is, internally created desire, that caused me to steal the sandwich, I am responsible. Now, of course, on the other hand, if I had not formed that desire, if I had said, nah, I'm not going to steal a sandwich, that would be wrong, Dracula would have hypnotized me, and then there would have been, as it were, an inserted desire for me to steal your sandwich. Dracula would have sort of implanted this mental state, which would have then made me do it. Now, Frankfurt agrees that in that case I wouldn't be responsible, but that's because the causally efficacious mental state was sort of external, had an external source, right? So that's why I wouldn't be responsible. It has nothing to do with what I could have done otherwise. So Frankfurt takes these cases to show that the principle of alternative possibilities does not give a necessary condition for moral responsibility, although it might still give a sufficient one. What is this talk of necessary and sufficient conditions? So, although this is increasingly less the case, analytic philosophers in particular used to love, and still occasionally do, love to talk about things in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. These are essentially very strict kind of mathematical definitions for counting as a certain type of thing. So a necessary condition is a condition which an object has to meet in order to count as a particular category. Okay, so geometry provides the best example for this kind of stuff, and I'm assuming that all of you took sort of a basic geometry in like middle school or high school or something. So in order to count as being a rectangle, an object must be a quadrilateral containing 4 right angles, right? So that means it has 2 pairs of sides, that is 4 total sides, and the pairs, 2 pairs of parallel sides, right? And slightly more than that, to be a rectangle, like a rhombus isn't a rectangle, right? So the slanty geometrical shapes aren't rectangles. So they have 4 right angles, that is, the vertices are L-shaped, right? So that's a rectangle. To be a triangle, an object must have 3 sides. It must be a closed plane figure with 3 sides. It must be a closed plane figure with 3 sides whose internal angles sum to 180 degrees, right? These are all things, each of those, which if an object doesn't have it, it cannot be a triangle by definition, right? So that's what a necessary condition is. So a sort of different type of example, think about being a mammal. In order to count as a mammal, you have to be a creature. You have to be a creature who's a member of a species in which some, I think always the females, I'm not exactly sure about that, have mammary glands, right? If you are a creature and none of the other creatures in your species group have mammary glands, then you are not a mammal, right? Necessary conditions. On the other hand, a sufficient condition is one which is good enough, sufficient, it suffices to make you a member of the category, but is not necessary. That is, you can be a member of the category without this characteristic, but having this characteristic is good enough to get you in. So again, going to geometry, we're all familiar with the idea that every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square. That is, it's good enough to count as a rectangle that you are a square. If you are a square, you're automatically a rectangle. But there are other rectangles that get to count as rectangles without being squares, right? So this one's a little bit more of a stretch again. And again, it might be slightly inaccurate. I am not a biologist. But it is sufficient to count as a mammal that you were gestated placentally, which is to say, contained in a sort of membrane while in fetal development. It is sufficient because everything, and again, this is where I'm not sure if that's exactly correct, but let's assume that it is, everything which is gestated placentally is a mammal. However, there are some things which are mammals which are not gestated placentally. Namely, there are 2 monotremes, mammals which lay eggs, so they're like birthed like birds, and those are the platypus and the echidna, right? Those things are mammals because of the mammary gland thing, but they are not gestated placentally. So it is good enough to count as a mammal that you are gestated placentally, but it is not required that you are gestated placentally. So hopefully you get a general idea of what necessary and sufficient conditions mean. Stepping back, how on earth does that apply to the principle of alternative possibilities? So before, when we first looked at it, the principle of alternative possibilities was taken to be a necessary condition on moral responsibility. That is, in order to count as being morally responsible, you had to be able to have done something else. That would be construing it as a necessary condition. However, Frankfurt says, no, it's not a necessary condition because, well, when I steal your sandwich, even though Dracula would have forced me to had I tried to choose not to, that is, even though I couldn't have done otherwise, because my sandwich stealing was the outcome of an internally created desire, I'm morally responsible for it. Now, it's open that Frankfurt will still say that being able to do otherwise is a sufficient condition on moral responsibility. That is, whenever you could have done otherwise, you do count as being morally responsible, but you don't have to be able to do otherwise in order to count as morally responsible. That is necessary but not sufficient. Hopefully that's clear. How does that give us a sort of a refutation, or how does that open up room for compatibilism to be true? Well, so here we have the refutation of the principle of alternative possibilities. Premise 1, an agent is morally responsible for what they have done only if they could have done otherwise. That's the statement of principle of alternative possibilities. Premise 2, if PAP, that is premise 1, is true, then Frankfurt-style cases absolve its subject of moral responsibility. Premise 3, Frankfurt cases do not absolve their subject of moral responsibility. Therefore, PAP is false. So here we have a modus tollens. So PAP is false, and that means that we can be morally responsible even when we couldn't have done otherwise, which means that we can be morally responsible even if determinism is true, and then on the assumption that moral responsibility entails free will, we have at least some room to say that we have free will, right? So that's the general shape of the argument here. And hopefully that's pretty clear. So the first part, we've been discussing essentially the whole time this argument and whether or not it's sound. And this is focused on giving an interpretation of moral responsibility, okay? Which is why we talked about all that principle of alternative possibility stuff. In the next part of the lecture, we're going to look at an argument against free will and see to what extent it kind of stacks up against Frankfurt's discussion of the principle of alternative possibilities.